Have you ever thought about why the person who follows a legendary leader almost always fails? Why does the successor to greatness seem to inevitably disappoint regardless of their actual abilities? Why is following success so much harder than creating success from nothing? This video will change how you see succession, legacy, and the invisible trap that destroys those who try to fill shoes that cannot be filled. Today we're diving into Law 41 from the 48 Laws of Power: avoid stepping into a great man's shoes. But this isn't just about leadership succession or following famous predecessors. This is about understanding one of the cruelest paradoxes of achievement, that the shadow of greatness destroys those who stand in it. That following a legend is a losing game no matter how capable you are. That the successor's failure is built into the structure of succession itself, not into their competence or effort. Let me tell you a story that will reveal everything. In 337 AD, a man named Caligula became Roman emperor following the death of Augustus, Rome's first emperor and one of the greatest leaders in history. Augustus had transformed Rome from a republic tearing itself apart through civil war into a stable empire. He ruled for 4 decades, brought peace, prosperity, and order. He was worshipped almost as a god. Rome mourned his death as a catastrophe. Caligula faced an impossible situation. He wasn't just following any emperor. He was following the man who had created the imperial system itself, who had saved Rome from chaos, whose accomplishments were legendary. Every action Caligula took was compared to Augustus. Every decision was measured against what Augustus would have done. Every failure was evidence he wasn't Augustus. Every success was diminished as merely maintaining what Augustus had built. Within 4 years, Caligula was assassinated. History remembers him as one of Rome's worst emperors: cruel, insane, tyrannical. But here's the question: was Caligula actually incompetent and insane, or was he destroyed by the impossible comparison to Augustus? Was he genuinely worse than other emperors, or did he just have the misfortune of following a legend whose shadow made any normal leadership look inadequate? We'll never know the truth about Caligula because the truth is invisible beneath the shadow of Augustus. That's the essence of Law 41. When you follow greatness, you cannot win. If you're mediocre, you're obviously inadequate compared to your predecessor. If you're good, you're still not as good as the legend. If you're excellent, you're merely maintaining what they built. There's no path to being seen as great yourself because greatness is already associated with the predecessor whose shoes you tried to fill. This isn't about individual capability. It's about structural position. The successor to greatness inherits an impossible standard and inevitable disappointment. They inherit sky-high expectations with no possibility of exceeding them because the predecessor's accomplishments have been elevated to mythical status. They inherit a comparison that they can only lose because comparisons always favor the legend over the successor. Now let me take you back 10,000 years to understand why humans are wired to compare successors unfavorably to legendary predecessors. In ancient societies, great leaders became the stuff of legend. Their stories were told and retold, embellished and enhanced. Over time, the actual person disappeared beneath the myth of their greatness. They became larger than life, perfect, unmatched. This mythologization served social functions. It created exemplars that unified groups around shared heroes. It established standards of excellence. It gave people stories of greatness to inspire and guide them. But it also created impossible standards that real living people could never match. The legend became superhuman, which made any successor merely human by comparison. Your brain today contains this tendency to mythologize past greatness while being critical of present performance. You remember the highlights of the past while experiencing all the messy reality of the present. This creates automatic unfavorable comparison between idealized past and realistic present. The successor never gets the benefit of mythologization because they're judged in real time against a predecessor who's been transformed into myth. This is why Law 41 is so devastating. It's not that successors are actually worse than their predecessors. It's that successors are compared to mythologized versions of predecessors that no real person could match. The game is rigged from the start. The successor is competing against a legend, not a person. They've already lost before they begin. Fast forward to the American Revolution and its aftermath, and we see this principle demonstrated perfectly. George Washington led America to independence, served as first president, established the precedents for the office, and retired peacefully after 2 terms. He became a legend, the indispensable man, the father of his country. His successor, John Adams, was doomed from the start. Adams was highly capable. He was a brilliant lawyer, accomplished diplomat, deep thinker about government and law. But he wasn't Washington. Everything he did was compared to Washington. His reserved personality was compared to Washington's commanding presence. His political struggles were compared to Washington's unifying leadership. His difficult presidency was compared to Washington's successful establishment of the office. Adams served 1 term and wasn't re-elected. History judges him as a mediocre president who failed to live up to Washington's legacy. But Adams didn't fail because he was incompetent. He failed because he tried to fill Washington's shoes. He inherited a comparison he couldn't win and expectations he couldn't meet. His actual accomplishments were invisible beneath the shadow of Washington's legend. Compare Adams to Thomas Jefferson, who followed Adams. Jefferson wasn't following Washington directly. The distance allowed him to avoid the worst of the comparison trap. He could establish his own identity and achievements without constant measurement against Washington. His presidency is remembered as successful partly because he wasn't trying to fill Washington's shoes. He had the space to create his own legacy. This reveals the strategic principle: if you must follow greatness, create distance from it. Don't try to emulate the great predecessor. Don't measure yourself against them. Don't fill their shoes. Create new shoes entirely. Build something different that can be judged on its own merits rather than as a continuation or comparison to what came before. The only way to escape their shadow is to move into different light entirely. Now let me show you how this operates in modern corporate succession, because businesses provide perfect laboratories for watching Law 41 destroy capable executives. When a legendary CEO retires, their successor almost always struggles regardless of competence. The successor inherits impossible expectations and inevitable disappointment. Think about what happened at Apple after Steve Jobs died. Tim Cook took over as CEO. Cook is extraordinarily competent. Under his leadership, Apple's revenue more than tripled, profits soared, the company became the first to reach $1 trillion then $2 trillion valuations. By objective measures, Cook has been phenomenally successful. Yet he's constantly criticized as not being Steve Jobs. He's not as visionary. He's not as innovative. He's not as inspiring. He's merely optimizing what Jobs built rather than creating something revolutionary. These criticisms persist despite Cook's obvious success because he's being measured against Jobs the legend rather than Jobs the actual person. He's stuck in Jobs' shadow no matter what he accomplishes. Or consider Disney after Walt Disney died. Multiple CEOs have led Disney over the decades since. Some have been quite successful by objective measures. But none are remembered as being in the same category as Walt. They're all measured against the man who created Disney, who invented the Disney magic, who was Disney. They're successors to a legend, which means they're automatically lesser regardless of their actual achievements. You see this pattern constantly in corporate succession. The CEO who follows a legend struggles. Their tenure is marked by criticism, unfavorable comparisons, and eventual replacement. Often the second or third successor after the legend is the one who finally achieves success because they're far enough removed from the legend's shadow to establish their own identity and legacy. Understanding this means recognizing that following a legendary leader is a poison chalice. The position looks prestigious and powerful, but it's actually a trap. You'll inherit impossible expectations, constant unfavorable comparisons, and probable failure regardless of your actual performance. The smart move is often to refuse succession to greatness and instead succeed someone less legendary whose shadow you can escape. Now here's where this gets really dark, and I need you to pay close attention because this is the twist that changes everything. Law 41 means that great leaders often inadvertently destroy their successors. The better the predecessor, the harder they make life for whoever follows. Greatness is a curse on those who come after it. The legendary leader leaves behind a legacy that destroys the next generation of leadership. Think about what this means for organizations and societies. The greatest leaders create the conditions for their successors to fail. Their excellence establishes standards and expectations that normal humans cannot meet. Their accomplishments create comparisons that make any subsequent achievement look inadequate. They leave their successors struggling in shadows and failing by comparison. This creates a tragic irony. The organization or society should want great leaders because great leaders accomplish great things. But great leaders create succession crises because no one can adequately follow them. The institution is damaged by the inevitable disappointment of succession after greatness. It would almost be better to have merely good leaders who don't create impossible standards for their successors. This suggests that truly wise great leaders think about succession differently. They deliberately build up multiple potential successors so no single person must carry the entire weight. They intentionally share credit and spotlight so they don't become the sole source of greatness. They systematically create distance between themselves and their successor before retiring so the successor has space to establish their own identity. They understand that their greatness can destroy the institution after they leave if they don't manage the succession carefully. But most great leaders don't do this. Either they don't think about succession consequences, or they're too invested in their own legend to deliberately diminish it for their successor's benefit. So they leave behind shadows that destroy whoever tries to follow them. The institution suffers from the succession crisis that their greatness created. Their final legacy becomes the succession disaster that follows them. Let me show you how Law 41 operates in family businesses and dynastic succession, because this is where the principle becomes most visible and most tragic. The founder who builds a business from nothing becomes a legend. Their children who inherit the business step into impossible shoes and usually fail to fill them. Think about how many great family businesses decline or fail in the second generation. The founder had vision, drive, and the ability to build something from nothing. The second generation grew up in comfort, never had to build from nothing, and is compared constantly to the founder's legendary accomplishments. They're judged as inferior regardless of their actual capabilities because they're trying to fill shoes that were made legendary precisely because they were unique and impossible to replicate. The third generation often completely destroys the business because they're even further removed from the founder's abilities and even more damaged by the comparison to the legend. The saying shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations captures this pattern. The founder builds greatness. The second generation struggles under the shadow. The third generation fails completely. The cycle is driven partly by Law 41. Successful dynastic succession requires either having second-generation members who refuse to follow directly in the founder's footsteps, creating their own ventures in different domains, or having founders who deliberately avoid becoming legends, sharing credit widely and building institutional capabilities that don't depend on any individual's genius. Both approaches avoid the succession trap of trying to fill great shoes. But most families don't do this. The founder becomes a family legend. The second generation is groomed to take over and measured against the legend. They inherit a comparison they cannot win and expectations they cannot meet. Family gatherings become painful reminders of how they'll never be the founder. The business suffers because it's led by people perpetually feeling inadequate compared to the impossible standard of the legendary founder. Now let me take you into how Law 41 operates in creative and artistic succession, because following a legendary artist or creator is just as impossible as following a legendary leader. The artist who creates something revolutionary establishes a style or approach that becomes their signature. Anyone who follows in that style is automatically derivative and inferior by comparison. Think about bands that try to continue after a legendary member dies or leaves. Queen after Freddie Mercury. Nirvana after Kurt Cobain. The Beatles after they broke up and individual members tried to match their collective greatness. In each case, the successors or solo efforts were measured against the legend and found wanting. The comparison was inevitable and unwinnable. Or directors who try to make sequels to legendary films. The sequel is automatically compared to the original and usually judged as inferior even when objectively well made. The original has become legendary through time and repetition. The sequel is experienced in real time with all its flaws visible. The comparison favors the original even when the sequel might be technically superior. This creates a trap for artists and creators. If you're too successful, too revolutionary, too legendary, you make it impossible for anyone including yourself to follow your own work. The sequel to your masterpiece will disappoint because it's compared to the masterpiece. The later work in your career will be judged as decline because it's compared to your legendary earlier work. The sophisticated artist avoids becoming too legendary in any single style or work. They constantly evolve, change genres, try different approaches. This prevents any single work from becoming such a legend that it casts shadows over everything that follows. They stay ahead of their own legend by refusing to let any one accomplishment define them. They don't step into their own great shoes by never stopping in one place long enough to leave shoes behind. Let me show you the specific strategies for surviving when you must follow greatness, because sometimes succession is unavoidable. Understanding these strategies can help you navigate the impossible situation of following a legend. First strategy: create clear differentiation. Don't try to emulate your predecessor. Do things differently. Establish a distinct identity, approach, and style. The more different you are, the less direct comparison is possible. You're not trying to be them, so being measured against them becomes less relevant. You're creating new shoes rather than filling old ones. Second strategy: acknowledge the legend explicitly. Rather than competing with your predecessor's memory, honor it openly. Make clear you're not trying to replace them, just continuing the work in your own way. This diffuses some of the comparison by accepting that the predecessor was legendary and you're something different. You're not in competition with the legend because you've conceded their legendary status. Third strategy: change the metrics of success. If your predecessor excelled at innovation, focus on execution and stability. If they were visionary, be practical. If they were charismatic, be systematic. Excel in different domains so you're not measured on the same dimensions where comparison to the legend is inevitable and unfavorable. You're succeeding differently rather than trying to match their type of success. Fourth strategy: build your own coalition. Don't rely on people loyal to your predecessor. Bring in your own team who are loyal to you and your approach rather than nostalgic for the predecessor. This creates a group of people who judge you on your own merits rather than constantly comparing you to the legend they served before. Fifth strategy: give it time. Legends accumulate power over years and decades. Your real-time performance will always look inferior to their mythologized accomplishments. But if you survive long enough, you can build your own track record that eventually stands on its own. Time and persistence can outlast the shadow, but only if you survive the difficult early years. Sixth strategy: consider refusing the succession. Sometimes the best move is to recognize the situation is impossible and decline to step into the shoes. Let someone else struggle with the inevitable comparison. Position yourself elsewhere where you can build your own legacy without competing with a legend. This feels like cowardice but is actually strategic wisdom. Let me take you deeper into the psychological mechanisms that make following greatness so destructive, because understanding why comparisons are so powerful helps you defend against them. The human mind has a cognitive bias called the peak-in rule, where we remember experiences by their best moments and their endings, not by average quality. This bias makes legends seem even greater than they were and makes successors seem even worse by comparison. Think about how you remember a legendary predecessor. You remember their greatest hits, their most impressive accomplishments, their best moments. You don't remember the mundane days, the failures they had along the way, the controversial decisions that only look good in hindsight. Your memory has edited their career into a highlight reel of excellence. This edited memory is what the successor is competing against. Meanwhile, you experience the successor in full reality. Every mistake is visible. Every mediocre day is experienced. Every controversial decision is judged in real time without knowing how it will turn out. The successor gets no benefit of editing or mythologization. They're judged on their full reality while being compared to the predecessor's edited highlight reel. This comparison is inherently unfair and unwinnable. This cognitive bias operates automatically and unconsciously. You can't just decide to judge fairly. Your brain naturally creates the unfair comparison because that's how memory and perception work. The only defense is awareness that the comparison is cognitively biased against the successor, which might create some conscious compensation for the automatic bias. But the bias remains powerful even when you're aware of it. The successor needs to understand they're not actually competing with their predecessor. They're competing with a mythologized, highlight reel version of their predecessor that bears limited resemblance to the actual historical person. But this mythological competitor is the one that matters because it's what exists in people's minds. The successor must find ways to avoid direct comparison to this myth because any comparison will favor the myth. Now let me show you how Law 41 operates in political dynasties and how children of political legends face impossible expectations. The child of a legendary politician grows up with constant comparison to a parent whose accomplishments have been elevated to mythical status. They can never escape the shadow no matter what they achieve. Think about political families like the Kennedys. John F. Kennedy became a legend, martyr, symbol of idealism and promise. His brothers and children who entered politics were constantly measured against JFK's legend. Bobby Kennedy had his own accomplishments but was always partly defined as JFK's brother. Ted Kennedy had a long Senate career but was always the Kennedy who never became president like his brother. The next generation of Kennedy politicians have all struggled with the weight of family legend. Or the Bush family. George H.W. Bush was president, CIA director, accomplished diplomat. His son George W. Bush became president but was constantly compared to his father, alternately praised for following family tradition or criticized for not matching his father's diplomatic skill. Jeb Bush's presidential campaign collapsed partly under the weight of family expectations and comparisons. The Bush name became more burden than asset because of impossible expectations it created. This pattern repeats across political dynasties worldwide. The Gandhis in India. The Bhuttos in Pakistan. The Le Pens in France. The children and grandchildren of political legends are damaged by the legends they're supposed to continue. Some succeed in their own right, but they do so by creating clear differentiation from the family legend rather than trying to embody or continue it. The strategic lesson is that political dynasties should avoid direct succession from legend to descendant. Put distance between the generations. Let cousins or unrelated protégés carry the legacy while children establish their own identities in different domains. The direct continuation from legendary parent to child is the most dangerous form of following greatness because family comparison is inescapable and constant. Let me take you into how Law 41 operates in academic and intellectual succession, because following a legendary scholar or thinker is just as impossible as following a legendary leader. The student who studies under a legendary professor or the scholar who works in the tradition established by a revolutionary thinker faces inevitable unfavorable comparison. Think about Freud's students and followers. They all worked in the shadow of Freud's revolutionary theories. Those who stayed close to Freud's ideas were dismissed as merely followers lacking original thought. Those who diverged from Freud were criticized for abandoning or misunderstanding the master. Jung, Adler, and others had to break completely with Freud to establish their own intellectual independence. The only way to escape Freud's shadow was to reject his approach entirely and build something different. Or Einstein's effect on theoretical physics. After Einstein's revolutionary work on relativity and quantum mechanics, every theoretical physicist worked in his shadow. New theories were judged partly by how they related to Einstein's framework. Physicists who extended Einstein's work were seen as elaborating on his ideas. Physicists who challenged Einstein were seen as attempting to overthrow a giant. Either way, Einstein's legend dominated the field for decades. This creates difficult dynamics in knowledge production. Revolutionary thinkers are necessary for progress. But they create shadows that make it hard for the next generation to make original contributions without being seen as derivative or oppositional. The field advances most when enough time has passed that the legend's shadow has faded enough for new original work to emerge without constant comparison to the revolutionary founder. The sophisticated scholar avoids working too directly in areas dominated by legendary predecessors. They find adjacent domains, new questions, or different methodologies that allow them to build original work without constant comparison to legends. They respect the giants but don't try to stand on their shoulders in ways that make the giant's size the only visible thing. They create their own space rather than trying to occupy space already filled with legendary presence. Now let me show you how Law 41 operates in technology and entrepreneurship, because following legendary founders creates unique challenges in fast-moving industries. When a visionary founder like Steve Jobs or Elon Musk creates a revolutionary company, their successor inherits both their accomplishments and their cult of personality. Think about what happens at companies after visionary founders leave or die. Apple after Steve Jobs. Tesla will eventually face this with Elon Musk. Microsoft navigated it when Bill Gates stepped back. In each case, the successor faces not just comparison to the founder's accomplishments but to the founder's vision, charisma, and cult following. The successor to a visionary founder can't just execute well. They must also somehow fill the visionary role that the founder played. But vision is precisely what can't be replicated or inherited. Either you have it or you don't. And even if the successor has vision, it will be different from the founder's vision, which makes it seem like deviation or decline rather than continuation. This is why tech company succession often involves bringing in professional managers rather than trying to find another visionary founder. Microsoft brought in Satya Nadella, who is excellent at execution and strategy but makes no claim to being the visionary that Gates was. This clear differentiation has actually helped Microsoft thrive after Gates because expectations were adjusted. Nadella isn't trying to be Gates, so he's not measured against Gates in the same direct way. The lesson is that when following a visionary founder, you must either find someone with their own distinct vision who can create clear differentiation, or you must explicitly shift from visionary leadership to execution-focused leadership and adjust expectations accordingly. Trying to be the same type of visionary as your legendary predecessor is the certain path to failure through inevitable unfavorable comparison. Let me take you into how Law 41 operates in sports, because following legendary athletes or coaches provides pure examples of the succession trap. When Michael Jordan retired from the Bulls, when Phil Jackson stopped coaching, when legendary players or coaches leave teams, their successors almost always disappoint regardless of their actual abilities. Think about quarterbacks who follow legendary QBs on NFL teams. Brett Favre was followed by Aaron Rodgers, which worked because Rodgers was himself exceptional and brought a different style. But most legendary QB successions involve decline because the successor is measured against the legend's highlight reel. The new QB might be objectively good but seems disappointing compared to memories of the legendary predecessor. Or coaches who follow legendary coaches. Who could follow John Wooden at UCLA? Who could follow Bear Bryant at Alabama? Who could follow Phil Jackson with the Bulls or Lakers? The successors aren't necessarily bad coaches. They're just compared to legends whose accomplishments have been mythologized, making any normal level of success seem like failure. Sports demonstrates Law 41 clearly because performance metrics are public and comparison is explicit. You can see exactly how the successor's statistics compare to the legends. But what you can't see is that the legend's statistics have been mentally elevated beyond their actual historical values, and the successor's statistics are being evaluated more critically than the legends were during their career. The comparison is rigged against the successor by cognitive biases that favor the legend. The teams that successfully navigate legendary succession usually do it by accepting a transition period where decline is expected and tolerated. They don't demand that the successor immediately match the legend. They give the successor space to build their own identity and track record over time. They explicitly tell fans and media that this is a rebuild or transition, which adjusts expectations and reduces unfavorable comparison. The acceptance of temporary decline is what allows eventual success. Now let me address the reverse scenario. What if you are the great person whose shoes will be impossible to fill? How do you think about succession when you recognize you've become a legend who will cast shadows that destroy your successors? This is the responsibility of greatness that most legendary leaders never consider. The wise legendary leader thinks about succession from the beginning, not the end of their tenure. They deliberately build up multiple potential successors so succession isn't dependent on any single person matching their own legend. They systematically share credit and spotlight to prevent themselves from becoming the sole source of organizational identity and success. They create institutional capabilities and systems that don't depend on their personal genius. They also consider stepping back gradually rather than leaving abruptly. A gradual transition allows the successor to establish themselves while the legend is still present to provide some support and legitimacy. It allows the successor to start building their own track record before they're fully responsible. It prevents the dramatic before and after comparison that makes successors look bad. Most importantly, the wise legendary leader thinks about their ego and how their need for legendary status might harm the organization after they leave. They must be willing to deliberately diminish their own legend, share credit they could claim, and build others up even when it reduces attention on themselves. This is psychologically difficult because it goes against the ego needs that often drive people to greatness in the first place, but the alternative is leaving behind an organization or institution that will struggle after you leave precisely because you were so great. Your greatness becomes a curse on those who follow. Your legend destroys the next generation of leadership. Your final legacy is the succession crisis and decline that your shadow created. This is not the legacy that truly great leaders should want. Let me show you one extended final case study that demonstrates both the trap of succession and how to avoid it. In 1945, Franklin D. Roosevelt died after serving as president through the Great Depression and most of World War II. He had been president for 12 years, longer than anyone before or since. He was legendary, having transformed the presidency and led America through its greatest crises. Harry Truman succeeded FDR and faced impossible expectations. He was compared constantly to Roosevelt and found wanting. He lacked FDR's charisma, his political skill, his public presence. His approval ratings were terrible. He was widely expected to lose the 1948 election. He seemed like a failed successor to a legend. But Truman did several things that ultimately allowed him to escape FDR's shadow and establish his own legacy. First, he made bold decisions that differentiated him from Roosevelt. He dropped atomic bombs to end World War II. He implemented the Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan for post-war reconstruction. He integrated the military. These decisions were controversial, but they were his own, not continuations of FDR's approach. Second, he explicitly didn't try to be FDR. He acknowledged he wasn't as skilled a politician or as charismatic a leader. He positioned himself as a plain-spoken normal person rather than competing with FDR's legendary status. This lowered some expectations and created space for his own identity. Third, he persisted through the difficult early years when comparison to FDR was constant and unfavorable. He didn't let criticism destroy him or make him quit. He kept making decisions and leading according to his own judgment rather than trying to guess what FDR would have done. Eventually, decades after his presidency, Truman came to be recognized as a great president in his own right. Not because he matched FDR, but because he established his own distinct legacy through bold decisions, persistent leadership, and refusing to be defined solely by comparison to his predecessor. But this recognition only came long after he left office, after enough time had passed for his own record to be judged separate from FDR's shadow. Truman's experience demonstrates both the trap of Law 41 and the possibility of eventually escaping it. Following greatness is nearly impossible. Most successors to legends fail. But with clear differentiation, explicit acknowledgement of the legend, bold distinct choices, and persistence through difficult early years, it's possible to eventually establish your own legacy separate from the predecessor's shadow. But it requires accepting years or even decades of unfavorable comparison while building toward eventual independent recognition. So as we close this exploration of Law 41, understand that succession to greatness is one of the most dangerous positions in any competitive domain. The successor inherits impossible expectations, inevitable unfavorable comparisons, and probable failure regardless of their actual competence. The shadow of the legend is not something you can overcome through effort or ability because the shadow is created by cognitive biases and mythologization that operate independently of your performance. The strategic wisdom is to avoid stepping into great shoes whenever possible. If you can position yourself elsewhere, build your own enterprise, or succeed someone less legendary, you'll have far better chances of success than trying to follow a legend. The prestigious position of succeeding greatness is actually a trap that destroys most who accept it. If you must follow greatness, your only hope is creating clear differentiation, explicitly acknowledging the legend rather than competing with it, making bold distinct choices that establish your own identity, and persisting through years of unfavorable comparison while building your own track record. Most successors fail at this. The few who succeed do so by essentially refusing to be successors and instead becoming something new that happens to occupy the position after greatness. For those who are or aspire to be great, think about your succession. Your greatness can destroy the organization after you leave if you're not careful. Build up others. Share credit and spotlight. Create institutional capabilities beyond your personal genius. Step back gradually rather than leaving abruptly. Deliberately diminish your legend to make space for successors. Your final responsibility as a great leader is ensuring your greatness doesn't destroy those who follow. Avoid stepping into a great man's shoes. The shoes will never fit because they were made for a legend, not a person. And trying to walk in shoes that don't fit will cripple you no matter how strong you are or how far you could walk in your own shoes. Create your own path. Build your own legacy. Let others follow in the legend's footsteps while you make new footprints in different ground. But let me take you even deeper into the structural forces that make succession to greatness so consistently destructive, because understanding these forces at a systemic level reveals why individual capability is almost irrelevant to succession outcomes. The successor isn't just competing with the predecessor's actual record. They're competing with organizational nostalgia, selective memory, and the human need for heroic narratives. Think about what happens psychologically to an organization after a legendary leader leaves. The organization enters a kind of collective mourning. People remember the good times under the legend and forget the difficulties. They remember successes and conveniently forget failures or controversies. The legend becomes increasingly idealized with each retelling of stories about the glory days. This isn't deliberate distortion. It's how collective memory works. The successor walks into this environment of collective nostalgia where the past has been idealized and the present is experienced in full messy reality. Every problem the successor faces is implicitly or explicitly compared to how the legend would have handled it. Never mind that the legend faced similar or worse problems, those problems have been edited out of collective memory. The legend is remembered as someone who had solutions, not someone who had problems. This creates a psychological dynamic where the organization is predisposed to be disappointed in the successor before they do anything. The successor represents the end of the golden age. Their presence is a reminder that the legend is gone. People project their grief and nostalgia onto criticism of the successor. The successor becomes a scapegoat for the organization's loss of the legendary leader. Understanding this means recognizing that much of the criticism and disappointment directed at successors isn't really about the successor's performance. It's displaced grief, nostalgia, and resistance to change. The organization is mourning the legend and criticizing the successor as a way of expressing that mourning. The successor can't fix this through better performance because the problem isn't actually their performance, the only solution is time and emotional processing. The organization needs to grieve the loss of the legend, work through the nostalgia, and eventually accept the new reality. This takes years, often a full tenure or more. During this time, the successor will face unwarranted criticism no matter what they do. If they survive this period, they might eventually be judged on their own merits. But most successors don't survive because the years of unfair criticism either get them fired or burn them out. Now let me show you how Law 41 operates specifically in the context of innovation and how following innovators creates unique succession challenges. The person who creates something revolutionary establishes not just a product or company but an entire paradigm. Their successor must either continue the paradigm, which makes them derivative, or change the paradigm, which makes them seem like they're betraying the founder's vision. Think about what happens at companies founded by revolutionary innovators. The founder created something that didn't exist before. They saw possibilities others didn't see. They took risks others wouldn't take. Their success seems to validate their unique vision and approach. The successor inherits this legacy of revolutionary innovation but faces a completely different challenge: sustaining and evolving something that already exists. The skills required for revolutionary innovation are completely different from the skills required for sustainable evolution. The founder needed vision, risk tolerance, and willingness to break rules. The successor needs operational excellence, strategic evolution, and ability to work within constraints. These are almost opposite skill sets. Yet the successor is judged as if they should possess the founder's revolutionary qualities while also providing the operational excellence the founder often lacked. This creates an impossible standard. If the successor focuses on operational excellence and sustainable growth, they're criticized for lacking the founder's vision and boldness. If they try to match the founder's revolutionary innovation, they're likely to fail because lightning rarely strikes twice, and they're criticized for reckless risks that don't pay off. Either way, they're positioned to disappoint. The sophisticated approach is explicitly shifting organizational expectations from revolutionary innovation to evolutionary excellence. The successor must help the organization understand that the revolutionary phase is over and the sustainable growth phase has begun. This requires different leadership and different priorities. The successor isn't less than the founder, they're different from the founder in ways the organization's current stage requires. But making this transition explicit and accepted is extremely difficult because it requires the organization to accept that the revolutionary era is over. People resist this acceptance because they want to believe the revolutionary spirit continues. So they pressure the successor to be revolutionary like the founder while also demanding the operational excellence the founder didn't provide. The successor is crushed between incompatible expectations. Let me take you into how Law 41 operates in religious and spiritual contexts, because succession in faith-based leadership is perhaps the most extreme version of this principle. When a religious founder or spiritual leader becomes legendary, their successors face not just organizational challenges but theological and spiritual ones. Think about religions that venerate their founders. Christianity after Jesus. Buddhism after Buddha. Islam after Muhammad. In each case, the founder is elevated to superhuman or divine status. Their teachings become sacred. Their life becomes perfect example. No subsequent leader can possibly match this because matching would require divinity or perfection that humans don't possess. This is why most major religions develop structures where no single successor tries to fill the founder's shoes directly. Christianity has the Pope and clergy but no one claims to be Jesus. Buddhism has various lineages of teachers but no one claims to be Buddha reborn. Islam explicitly states Muhammad is the final prophet. These structures evolved precisely because direct succession to religious founders is impossible. When religious movements do attempt direct succession, they typically fail or fracture. Splinter groups form around different claimants to the founder's mantle. Succession crises tear apart the community. The original unity under the legendary founder is replaced by sectarian division over succession. The founder's legacy is damaged by the succession conflicts their greatness created. The lesson is that certain kinds of greatness are so profound that succession is literally impossible. The only solution is creating institutional structures that don't rely on any individual matching the founder. Distribute the founder's functions across multiple roles and people. Institutionalize the founder's teachings rather than trying to embody them in a single successor. Accept that the founder was unique and create systems that don't require replicating that uniqueness. Now let me show you how Law 41 operates in the context of cultural and social movements, because movement leadership succession faces all the challenges of organizational succession plus the additional challenge of maintaining movement momentum and ideology. The legendary movement founder becomes symbol of the movement itself. Their successor must somehow separate personal leadership from movement identity. Think about civil rights movements after charismatic leaders. The civil rights movement after Martin Luther King Jr., the Indian independence movement after Gandhi, the anti-apartheid movement after Mandela. In each case, the leader became so identified with the movement that their departure created leadership vacuum and movement fragmentation. Successors to these leaders faced not just the challenge of filling legendary shoes but the challenge of maintaining movement cohesion after the unifying figure was gone. The legendary leader had held together diverse factions through personal authority and moral stature. The successor lacks this personal authority and moral stature by definition, because those qualities were what made the founder legendary. The movements typically respond in one of two ways. Either they fragment into multiple successor movements, each claiming the founder's legacy, or they institutionalize into formal organizations that replace charismatic leadership with bureaucratic structure. Neither approach successfully continues the revolutionary energy of the founder's leadership. Either way represents decline from the legendary era, which creates nostalgia and criticism of how the movement has changed. The sophisticated movement founder thinks about this and deliberately builds institutional structures before leaving. They distribute leadership among multiple people. They create decision-making processes that don't depend on personal charisma. They intentionally reduce their own centrality to the movement so their departure doesn't create vacuum. Martin Luther King Jr. was beginning to do this before his assassination, building organizational structures to outlast individual leaders, but most movement leaders don't do this because movements often depend on charismatic centralization during their revolutionary phase. The very things that make movements successful initially, charismatic centralized leadership, are what makes succession impossible. The founder creates their own succession crisis through the same qualities that made them successful. There's no easy solution to this paradox. Let me take you into how Law 41 operates across different time scales and how the passage of time affects succession dynamics. Immediate succession, within years of the legend's departure, is nearly impossible. Medium-term succession, within a decade or two, remains very difficult. Long-term succession, after multiple generations, finally allows escape from the legend's shadow. Think about why immediate succession fails so consistently. The legend is still fresh in everyone's memory. The comparison is constant and explicit. The emotional attachment to the legend is still intense. The successor has no time to establish their own identity before being measured against the legend. The organizational culture still embodies the legend's personality and approach. Everything conspires to make the immediate successor fail. Medium-term succession is somewhat easier because time has started to fade the legend's memory. The comparison is less constant. Some people in the organization never worked with the legend and judge the successor on their own merits. The organizational culture has started to evolve beyond the legend's personal stamp. But the legend's shadow still looms large, and comparison remains a significant burden. Long-term succession, after the legend has been gone for decades and most people never met them, finally allows relative freedom. The legend is historical rather than personal memory. The successor isn't really following the legend anymore, they're just occupying the same role in a completely different era. The organization has evolved so much that comparison is no longer relevant. The legend's shadow has finally faded enough for new leadership to shine. This suggests that organizations should think about succession not as a single event but as a multi-generational process. The immediate successor is essentially a sacrifice, someone who will struggle and possibly fail but who creates space for the second or third successor to eventually succeed. Except that the first successor after a legend probably won't be the one who establishes new greatness. They're the transition figure who absorbs the shadow so future successors can operate in light. This seems cruel to the immediate successor, but it's realistic about the structural forces at work. The immediate successor needs to understand they're probably a transitional figure rather than the one who will establish new legend. Their job is surviving, maintaining the institution, and creating space for the next generation. If they can accept this role and its limitations, they can serve the institution well even though they'll never receive the credit or recognition their actual contribution deserves. Now let me address the psychological toll that Law 41 takes on successors, Because being constantly compared unfavorably to a legend is emotionally and psychologically damaging. The successor experiences chronic stress, imposter syndrome, and often depression from the impossibility of their situation. Understanding this psychological dimension is crucial for successors who want to survive the role. Think about the daily experience of a successor to greatness. Every decision you make is questioned through the lens of what the legend would have done. Every success is minimized as merely maintaining what the legend built. Every failure is magnified as evidence you're not up to the legendary standard. You're working as hard or harder than your predecessor but receiving none of the credit and much more of the criticism. This creates profound imposter syndrome. You feel like a fraud occupying a position you don't deserve. You question your own abilities constantly because external feedback is uniformly negative compared to the legend. You experience decision paralysis because you're second-guessing everything through imagined comparison to how the legend would have handled it. You're psychologically trapped by the shadow. Many successors to legends experience depression, burnout, or stress-related health problems. The psychological toll of constant unfavorable comparison is severe. Some quit prematurely because they can't tolerate the emotional damage. Others stay but become bitter or cynical. Very few survive the experience psychologically intact because the structural forces are so powerful and unrelenting. The defense requires exceptional psychological resilience and usually professional support. Therapy or coaching specifically focused on managing the unique stresses of succession. Strong personal relationships outside the organization where you can be yourself rather than the inadequate successor. Activities and identities completely separate from your succession role. Conscious work to maintain self-esteem independent of external evaluation. Most successors don't do this psychological work and suffer severe damage as a result. Organizations that care about their successors' well-being should provide this psychological support systematically. Acknowledge the unfairness of the comparison. Provide coaching and therapy. Create safe spaces for successors to express frustration and doubt. Actively push back against unfair criticism. Shield the successor from some of the harsh comparison while they're establishing themselves. But most organizations don't do this because they're too busy mourning the legend to recognize they're destroying the successor. Let me show you one more extended case study that demonstrates the full complexity of Law 41 across multiple dimensions. In 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev presided over the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Boris Yeltsin became the first president of post-Soviet Russia. Yeltsin faced an impossible succession situation. He was following not just Gorbachev but the entire Soviet system, with Lenin and Stalin as the founding legends. Yeltsin had to build a new Russian state from the ruins of the Soviet collapse. He faced economic chaos, political instability, separatist movements, and a traumatized population. His performance was mixed. Some economic reforms succeeded while others failed catastrophically. He struggled with health problems and accusations of alcoholism. His presidency was marked by crisis and controversy. But was Yeltsin actually incompetent, or was he facing an impossible situation that would have destroyed any leader? He was following the collapse of an empire, trying to build a new system, navigating unprecedented economic and political transformation, all while being compared to the stability of the Soviet era that people remembered nostalgically despite its oppression and dysfunction. The Russian population compared Yeltsin not to the reality of Soviet oppression but to idealized memories of Soviet stability. They forgot the shortages, the political terror, the economic stagnation. They remembered full employment, predictable lives, superpower status. Yeltsin's tumultuous presidency looked terrible compared to these selective memories, even though he was dealing with the consequences of Soviet failures. Yeltsin's successor, Vladimir Putin, benefited from not being the immediate successor to the Soviet system. Putin came after Yeltsin had absorbed the worst of the comparison and transition. Putin could build on a foundation that Yeltsin had struggled to create. He could offer stability after Yeltsin's chaos. He succeeded partly because Yeltsin had failed in ways that created space for a different approach. Yeltsin was the sacrificial first successor who made Putin's success possible. This demonstrates the full cruelty of Law 41. Yeltsin faced impossible circumstances and inevitable failure. He's remembered as a failed leader. But his failure created the conditions for his successor's success. He absorbed the shadow so Putin could operate in relative light. His sacrifice was necessary for Russia's evolution but went unrecognized and unappreciated. This is the fate of most successors to greatness, necessary failures that enable future success. So as we truly close this deep exploration of Law 41, understand that succession to greatness is perhaps the most structurally rigged situation in power dynamics. The successor cannot win because the game is designed for their failure. Cognitive biases favor the legend. Organizational nostalgia resists the successor. Impossible expectations guarantee disappointment. The shadow cannot be escaped through competence or effort. If you must follow greatness, accept that you're probably a transitional figure rather than a new legend. Your job is survival, maintaining the institution, and creating space for future leaders who will benefit from the distance you create from the original legend. This is unglamorous and unrewarding, but it's realistic about what's actually possible for immediate successors. If you are great or aspire to be, think about your succession as part of your responsibility. Don't leave behind shadows that destroy those who follow. Build institutional capabilities beyond yourself. Distribute credit and power. Step back gradually. Accept that diminishing your legend serves the institution better than maximizing it. Your final test of greatness is whether the institution thrives after you leave, which requires ensuring your greatness doesn't destroy your successors. Avoid stepping into great shoes. Build your own path. Create your own standards. Establish your own identity. Let legends remain legends while you become something new. The only way to escape another's shadow is to walk into different light. That's Law 41. That's everything.